Okay, so this is chapter 11 of Zodiac. Sherry Jo Bates. Monday, November 9th, 1970. Avery finally received the information on the Riverside killing, the only unsolved murder in Riverside history. Among the reports on the girl's murder had been a photograph of a hand-printed letter received 5 months after the killing. The police had considered it only another fraudulent message from some crank. At the time, the signature at the bottom had meant nothing to them. The author had signed his message with a single letter, Z. In 2 hours, Avery was on his way to Riverside, 62 miles southeast of Los Angeles. Avery met with Detective Sergeant Dave Boney, the chief investigator presently assigned to the case, and was allowed access to the files. The victim was Sherry Jo Bates. Since her murder over 4 years ago, the case file, number 352-481, had become voluminous. In conference with Bonnie and Captain Cross, Avery began to reconstruct the dead girl's last day in detail. Inwardly, Avery felt that Zodiac had written the penciled note and could be Sherry Jo's slayer. According to the police report, Sherry Jo had been an 18-year-old college freshman, an honors student whose main ambition had been to become an airline stewardess. She had been a cheerleader at Ramona High near Riverside City College and was one at RCC. The victim was 5 foot 3 inches tall, weighed 110 pounds, had blue eyes, blonde hair, and a fair complexion, although at the time of her death she was deeply tanned. She wore glasses, but only for studying. She had lived alone with her father, Joseph, at 4195 via St. Jose in Riverside. Joseph was a machinist at the Corona Naval Ordnance Laboratory. Her mother had left in 1965, and her brother was serving in the Navy in Florida. The day of the murder, October 30th, 1966, Joseph and his daughter attended Mass at St. Catherine's Church on Brockton. At 9 a.m., they ate breakfast at Sandy's Restaurant in Hardman Center. At 10 o'clock, Joseph left the house to spend the day at the beach. Around 3 p.m., Sherry Jo called her friend Stephanie. There was no answer. She called again at 3:45. This time, Stephanie was home. Sherry Jo asked if she wanted to go to the college library to get some books and study a little. Stephanie declined, and Sherry Jo left the house somewhere between 4:30 and 5 o'clock. At 4:30, some of her friends had passed Sherry Jo's house and noticed her lime green Volkswagen still parked in front. At 5 o'clock, Joseph Bates returned home. When Sherry Jo left the house, she was wearing a pair of faded red capri pants and a long-sleeved pale yellow blouse with a ribbon tie at the throat. She carried an oversized red and tan woven straw bag. On her feet were white sandals with straps around the heels and between the first and second toes. At 5 p.m., Joseph Bates found this note taped to the refrigerator, Captain Cross told Avery. He handed the reporter a plastic-covered note. It read, "Dad went to RCC Library." Joseph took a photo message for Sherry Jo from Stephanie and went directly out again, said Cross. At approximately 5:30, Sherry Jo noticed that she had misplaced her term paper biography and called a coworker, Donna, at the Riverside National Bank. Donna hadn't seen it. The two talked for a while. "Now I'll have to start all over on my note cards," Sherry Jo told her. "We have a witness report," said Bonnie, that at 6:10 p.m., one of Sherry Jo's girlfriends saw her go by in her VW headed over toward RCC on Magnolia. The friend said she waved to her, but evidently Sherry Jo didn't see her. She didn't wave back. Another report came from an Air Force man who lived near the library. He was passed by a light green VW driven by a blonde female up an alley parallel to Magnolia and east of the Sherry Lynn apartments. He recalled that the VW was followed closely by a 1965-66 bronze Oldsmobile. "We figured Sherry Jo arrived at the RCC Library Annex around 6 and went into the library. She had friends studying in the library, but none of them recall seeing her. We know she actually entered the library only because of 3 books on the electoral college she checked out, which were found on the front seat of her car. Evidently, while she was in the library, the assistant gained access to the engine and pulled out the distributor coil and the condenser, and connected the middle wire of the distributor. He may have actually gone into the library and waited while she ran the battery down, trying to start the engine. He probably came up and offered help, offered her a lift in his car. Then he got her to go down the unlit gravel road to the parking lot about 75 yards east of her car. The killer then placed one hand over her mouth and with the other pressed a knife against her throat. He must have begun choking her, said Bonnie, but she was an athletic girl and fought back with such force that we found his paint-splattered wristwatch where she had ripped it off. She scratched his face. She must have screamed then. We have a report. A neighbor heard an awful scream between 10:15 and 10:45 p.m., and then about 10 minutes of silence, and finally the sound of an old car starting up. A man returning to the area at 10:30 told us he heard 2 screams then. The medical report said that Sherry Joe had been kicked in the head. A short knife had been plunged into her chest twice. Her left cheek and upper lip were cut, and in 3 slashes to her throat her jugular was severed as well as her voice box, and she was almost decapitated. She was face down on the ground when the killer plunged the knife into her left shoulder blade. The churned-up ground where they had struggled looked like a freshly plowed field, read the notation. Police theorized the killer spent time looking for his watch before taking off for his car. It was midnight when Joseph Bates returned home and found a note he had left for Sherry Joe undisturbed. He figured his daughter was out with her girlfriends and went to sleep. Next morning, she still wasn't home, so he called Stephanie to see if she was there. He reported his daughter missing at exactly 5:43 a.m. 45 minutes later, Halloween morning, Cleopas Martin, the groundskeeper at RCC, turned his sweeping machine onto Terencia. He saw the body lying face down, her straw purse next to her. He called us. We roped off the area. The girl's purse still contained all of her ID and 56 cents. 10 feet away from the body, we found the killer's Timex watch with a 7-inch circumference. The black band was broken away from one side of the face. We found a shoe print of a type of shoe sold only in military outlets, such as nearby March AFB. It was size 8 to 10 and reproduced by Leavenworth prisoners. We found debris, scrapings of human skin and hair under her nails. On the front seat, we found the greasy prints of a palm, and on the top of a nearby building, said Bonnie, we found a set of VW keys, and these were of no relation to the Bates murder. Avery scanned the autopsy report, made several notes, shut his notebook, and replaced it in his inside jacket pocket. The earliest the girl could have been killed would have been 9 o'clock Sunday night when the library closed. The awful scream was heard around 10:30 and is most likely when she was killed. Questions flooded Avery's mind. Did Sherry Joe stand with her killer for nearly 2 hours in the darkness between the 2 deserted frame houses? Did they talk, and did she know her killer? What was the killer waiting for? The report said the knife used by the killer had a blade 1 1/2 inches wide and was 3 1/2 inches long. Drops of blood led from the murder site to Teresia. Avery was told that just 24 hours after the slaying, Cross and his men had already interrogated 75 people and were checking military men from the nearby air base as well as Sherry Joe's fellow students and teachers. The most promising suspect was a local youth who knew the pretty cheerleader. A good case of circumstantial evidence could be built against the local youth, but nothing substantial enough to hold up in court. Cross and Bonine believed that he was guilty. Avery wondered if he could place this man in Northern California at the time of the Zodiac killings. 5 days after the attack, Sherry Joe was buried. While hundreds mourned at the funeral, homicide detectives worked their way through the crowd, scanning faces for any sign of the killer. Joseph Bates collapsed at the end of the service, said Cross. He was crying out, "My girl, my girl." 9 days after the funeral, said Bonnie, Captain Cross called Bonine. Oh my god, I don't know why I keep reading that, Bonnie. Bonine. Captain Cross asked all persons who had been in the library on the night of the murder to recreate their movements. That was 65 people. We had them wear the same clothes, sit in the same seats, park in the same places. Captain Cross's own car doubled for the Bates auto. We asked them what time they arrived, what people they saw outside, where they parked, and what vehicles they noticed. We asked them to tell us if they recalled seeing anyone who was here the night of the killing who didn't come in to be questioned. We tape-recorded all interviews. The captain himself took fingerprints in a lock of hair from each man. The FBI got the prints, and we sent the hair samples to CI&I. We got 2 missing, a woman and a heavy-set young man about 5 feet 11 inches tall with a beard. We were out to find any young man with scratches on his face. Bonine looked down at the file and shook his head. We never found either of them, or the 47 to 52 tan gray Studebaker with oxidized paint that was seen that night. On a second briefing, Avery was told about a confession the cops received. We think the killer had a pretty thorough knowledge of identification techniques, said Bonine. He devised a method that would frustrate the best of experts. It went something like this. First, he set his typewriter to all caps. Then he made a book of typewriter paper and carbon, about 13 pages of paper, 12 of carbon. By sending one of the last copies of the letter, he ensured that there would be no prints and that the type would be so blurred that identification of the make of typewriter would be tough. He opened his top drawer and passed Avery a photocopy. This has never been printed in its entirety before. I obtained a complete copy only with the use of a magnifying glass and a copy of a photo of a desk at Riverside PD on which the confession was propped. Narlow could not show me his copy but proofread mine and said it was correct. She was young and beautiful, but now she is battered and dead. She is not the first, and she will not be the last. I lay awake nights thinking about my next victim. Maybe she will be the beautiful blonde that babysits near the little store and walks down the dark alley each evening about 7. Or maybe she will be the sharply blue-eyed brunette that said no when I asked her for a date in high school. But maybe it will not be either. But I shall cut off her female parts and deposit them for the whole city to see. So don't make it so easy for me. Keep your sisters, daughters, and wives off the streets and alleys. Miss Bates was stupid. She went to the slaughter like a lamb. She did not put up a struggle, but I did. It was a ball. I first pulled the middle wire from the distributor. Then I waited for her in the library and followed her out after about 2 minutes. The battery must have been about dead by then. I then offered to help. She was then very willing to talk with me. I told her that my car was down the street and that I would give her a lift home. When we were away from the library walking, I said it was about time. She asked me, about time for what? I said it was about time for you to die. I grabbed her around the neck with my hand over her mouth and the other hand with a very small knife at her throat. She went very willingly. Her breast felt very warm and firm under my hands. But only one thing was on my mind, making her pay for the brush-offs that she had given me during the years prior. She died hard. She squirmed and shook as I choked her, and her lips twitched. She let out a scream once, and I kicked her head to shut her up. I plunged the knife into her, and it broke. I then finished the job by cutting her throat. I am not sick. I am insane. But that will not stop the game. This letter should be published for all to read it. It just might save that girl in the alley. But that's up to you. It will be on your conscience, not mine. Yes, I did make that call to you also. It was just a warning. Beware. I am stalking your girls now. CC, Chief of Police, Enterprise. That the killer mentioned the game, insisted the letter must be published, and called the police about the crime were all trademarks of the Zodiac killer. The killer mailed this letter from a secluded rural mailbox unstamped. We never had any doubt that they were from Sherry Joe's murder because of the top-secret details he included, principally the ripped-out middle wire of the VW's distributor, said Bonine. The Riverside Press Enterprise ran an article on the Bates case exactly 6 months after Sherry Joe's death. The following day, the police received a new letter from the killer. Avery was shown a crudely penciled note on a piece of common 3-holed binder paper. In large sprawling letters that tilted downward toward the left was this message: Bates had to die, there will be more. At the bottom of the blue-lined paper was a small number 2, or the letter Z. The envelope carried 2 4-cent Lincoln stamps, double the postage. The letter had been placed into Sherry Joe's file, but had been considered crank mail and not connected with the confession letter in any way. Avery was left alone to go through the Bates file. He soon made the discovery that there were 2 other identical Bates Must Die letters. One was addressed to the Press Enterprise and the other, cruelly, to Joseph Bates. Avery uncovered a photo of a desktop discovered 5 months after the murder by a custodian at the RCC library in a storage area. It had been defaced with a gruesome poem, reproduced for the first time, 5 inches deep by 3 7/8 inches wide, etched into the varnished surface in blue ballpoint pen. Sick of living, unwilling to die, cut clean, if read, clean, blood spurting, dripping, spilling, all over her new dress. Oh well, it was red anyway. life draining into an uncertain death. She won't die. This time. Someone'll find her. Just wait till next time. This was different from the other sick letters the department had gotten since Sherry Joe's death. This one was signed. At the bottom of the bloody verse were two lowercase letters, R and H. In conference with Cross, Avery pointed out that the penciled printing on the Bates Must Die notes was similar to the recent blue felt tip pen lettering of the Zodiac messages to the Chronicle, and that the printing on the notes matched almost exactly the writing on the desktop. The reporter was able to convince Cross and Bonine to activate the Bates investigation in association with the Zodiac case. It was decided that Avery would hand carry the evidence to Sacramento in sealed envelopes to maintain the chain of evidence, and deliver it to Sherwood Morrill, expert for the Bureau of Criminal Identification and Investigation, questioned documents. Avery phoned Morrill at his home and asked to meet him at the Sacramento airport. Thursday, November 12, 1970. Avery boarded the plane for Sacramento carrying the actual letters and envelopes from Sherry Joe's killer and a photo of the desktop poem. Morrill was waiting anxiously for him. He did a preliminary examination on the spot. The carbon copy letters were very dim and made identification of the typewriter and typeface next to impossible. Morrill later discovered that the typewriter used was a portable Royal Canterbury shaded with elite type. Avery then produced the hand-printed pencil letters he had found in the police file. After a moment, the hand-printing expert spoke. This doesn't look anything like Zodiac's writing, he said. The expert then looked at the envelope to the penciled message. This begins to look alike now, Morrill said. He stared at the envelope. Yes, this is what gives it away. The Riverside letters were by the same person who wrote the Zodiac letters in Northern California. Morrill also took the initial at the bottom of the note to be a Z. He said, I'll get hold of Armstrong and Tashi on this. But Avery was excited now and left immediately for San Francisco, notifying Armstrong before Morrill could. Morrill, a consummate technician, also had the forethought to get samples of Avery's own handprinting to check against the printing on the Riverside letters. Avery checked out clean. Monday, November 16, 1970. Morrill notified Avery that after 4 days of study, he could say that the printing specimens on the letters discovered in Riverside were unquestionably the work of Zodiac. The hand-printing scratched on the desk is the same as on the 3 letters, particularly like that on the envelopes, and this handwriting is by the same person who has been preparing the Zodiac letters that have been received by the Chronicle. Avery wrote an article on the findings of his Riverside trip. It was printed in Tuesday's Chronicle under the banner Zodiac Link is Definite. Cross opened the Bates case on a full-scale basis, but said it was possible that the Zodiac was just trying to capitalize on publicity. After all, the letters were received 7 months after the killing. A suspect had been in jail, is now out on bail, and there has never been enough evidence to convict him of the Bates murder, said Cross. I'm not a handwriting expert, but it seems to me altogether possible that whoever the Zodiac is, he could have read about the Bates slaying, noted it was unsolved, and could have sent those letters to claim credit for it without having had anything to do with it. Please note the Bates girl was killed in October 1966, and those letters came in April 1967. There was nothing in the letters to indicate that our local boy didn't do it. Thursday, November 19, 1970. Avery wrote another story for the Chronicle about a closed conference in Riverside attended by homicide detectives for San Francisco, Sacramento, and Napa. The 9-hour meeting was a direct result of Avery's discovery of what he called the Riverside Connection. When the meeting was over, Cross, Tashi, Narlo, and Inspector Mel Nicolai of CI&I were secretive about what had been discussed. Avery was able to discover that the consensus of the detectives was that at one time Zodiac had close ties to Riverside. Cecilia Ann Shepard, the Berryessa victim, had been a student at Riverside. The most curious aspect of the Bates murder was the lack of a boast from Zodiac, who in the past never failed to quickly brag about his murders. Did he refuse to take credit for Sherry Joe's murder because he had made some slip-up, left some clue behind that could incriminate him? Because of the desktop poem, the police knew that Zodiac was in the RCC library prior or subsequent to the crime. The most obvious blunder on the part of the mass slayer would be the initials at the bottom of the gory verse. Who was R.H.? Or did the initials stand for red herring? Or did they stand for the blood factor R.H.? Tuesday, November 24th, 1970. 12 days earlier, Morrill had received 7 handwriting samples of the man Riverside police believed was the Bates killer. Now he had finished his examination of them. There was no match. Friday, November 27, 1970. Police announced that a state expert has compared our main suspect's handprinting and ruled that it is not the same as Zodiac's. But that does not mean that our local man did not kill the girl. It merely means that the Riverside man is not the Zodiac.